Hello and welcome to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Dan, and as always joined by Owain. Owain, how are you doing, knowing that your VO2max is as high as it's ever been?
Yeah, pretty good. Good Christmas present. Yeah, we'll go into it more in the, I guess, first Road to Barry series, but yeah, good VO2max test to finish off. Good submax test. That was the main thing. I didn't really care about the VO2max test, to be honest.
Yeah, you did. You did. You did. Will I put it out on Instagram early, a week or so ago on a poll. What do we think Owain got? And are we going to reveal what you got? Your VO2max score?
I think leave it till the first Road to Barry. Yeah,
we're holding everyone in suspense. Okay.
I'm going to do a reel at some point.
Yeah. All that content I produced. So. Yeah. I guess that's that's just hopefully a nice segue into our topic for today, which is training to improve VO2max. So what does the research say about what sort of training is going to optimize your VO2max, get it as high as possible, basically? How can you go about it? What sort of training sessions should you be doing to improve your VO2max? Yeah, that's it basically, right?
Yeah. Some research and then hopefully some practical sort of take-home messages, because I think we're maybe of the opinion that at the very least a lot of what people do isn't particularly optimized. It's maybe couched in some old school ideas, and maybe some of the research clears that up, and hopefully there's some good take-homes from this.
Yeah, and I agree. I think looking at what some of the traditional club sessions that you'd see going on that people would say are VO2max type sessions, I would argue are not. They're good training, but they could be better. I think people, in general, maybe run them a bit too hard and don't do quite enough work. But we'll break that down over the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes, probably an hour. Knowing us.
The way we go, yeah.
So I guess firstly we need to talk about actually what is VO2max, and we've mentioned it before. I think people have got a pretty good idea of the concept of VO2max, but basically it's just the maximal rate in which our body can take in and use oxygen in the muscles. So if we push someone as hard as they can in a 3k 2k race, 5k race, doesn't really matter, something that's short but not too short, what is the maximum rate of oxygen that they can breathe in through their lungs, get into the blood, transport to the muscles, and then use that for aerobic metabolism. And how we'd assess that in the lab is we'd get someone hooked up to a metabolic cart, into a Ventus in our case, which measures someone's oxygen consumption. We'd start them off at a reasonably comfortable intensity, increase the speed every minute until they pretty much can't go any further. And what you'd see is that over the first few minutes, there'll be a linear increase in VO2, oxygen consumption, with speeds, but they'll get to a point where the speed increases, but oxygen consumption plateaus. It doesn't go up anymore. And so that's VO2max. Make sense?
Yeah, and I guess we can break down the components of what influences VO2max, or what physiologically is sort of going on. So I guess first of all, cardiac output is one of the main sort of determinants of VO2max. So that's looking at stroke volume and heart rate. It's cardiac output. I think I got that right.
Yeah. So how much the stroke volume is actually how much blood is being pumped out in a single beat, and then obviously heart rate is heart rate. So when we push someone to VO2max, their heart rate will be as high as possible, pretty much, and they'll be pumping out as much blood as they can in a single beat, because actually that increases with intensity as well. So at low intensities, our stroke volume is going to be lower than when we're pushing someone really, really hard. Basically, the heart can contract and twist more to eject more blood, called ejection fraction. So there's a higher ejection fraction, so more blood is pumped out at high intensities, and that's getting a bit complicated. But basically, the left ventricle, where blood is pumped out to the body, it contracts, but it also twists, and as the intensity gets higher, it's like a when you're wringing out a sponge, or then the heart twists more as the intensity gets higher, and that ejects more blood. So yeah, it's to do with the stroke volume when you're at VO2 max. What your max heart rate is, that's going to basically mean what's your maximum cardiac output, how many liters per minute are you distributing to the body. So that's probably like the first determinant of VO2 max.
And then second is what's called AVO2 difference, which is essentially I guess the offloading of oxygen at the working muscles. It's probably the simplest way to describe it. So cardiac output is getting the oxygen to your muscles, and then AVO2 difference is getting the oxygen into the muscle. So getting on a train and then getting off a train, I guess.
Yeah. So how much of that oxygen are you extracting from the blood? And like they do pretty nasty studies where they invasively measure this. So they look at they put lines in, and they look at actually what's the oxygen concentration of the blood that's going into the muscle, and what's the oxygen concentration of the blood coming out of the muscle, and you'll see that actually it's really high, like 95%, that sort of ballpark is extracted from the blood. So we're quite good at extracting pretty much all of that oxygen we can during exercise. And again, that's I guess there's one last major one.
And now it's completely lost. It's gone out of my mind now.
Oh, obviously you're doing your PhD, your master's on, right? So the last one, the oxygen carrying capacity. The oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So actually, how much blood have you got, and how much hemoglobin is there in your blood? So when you go to altitude, this is one of the main things we try to improve. How much hemoglobin have we got? And so if we increase that hemoglobin content, then the blood is going to hold more oxygen. And so if the maximal cardiac output might be the same, but if each unit of blood is holding more oxygen, then that's going to get there's going to be a greater flow of oxygen to the muscles that can then be extracted. So that's your three main determinants of VO2 max: like maximal cardiac output, how much blood can you distribute to the body, oxygen carrying capacity of that blood, so how much oxygen is in that blood, how much hemoglobin have you got, because the more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen that you can be bound to that hemoglobin and then released to the muscle where it gets when it gets to the capillaries there. So that's the last bit: how much of that oxygen can you rip off the hemoglobin and extract and get into the muscle to be used for aerobic metabolism. Hopefully that makes sense. But they're like, you could probably break it down further, and there probably are a couple of other little bits you could talk about, but they're the big three really. And bear with me 1 second. So in terms of actually what happens with training, well, the research indicates that most of the improvement you get in VO2 max is actually coming from improvements in the cardiac output. So it's mostly cardiac adaptations you're getting. So effectively, with training, you can increase the size of the left ventricle. So it can be what we call an eccentric hypertrophy. So the left ventricle stretches, and so there's a bigger space for blood to fit into. And there's also some thickening of the walls as well. So it can hold more blood, but also contract more and twist more to eject more blood. And that's what most of the training is going into. It's actually a cardiac adaptations. We can also increase the oxygen carrying capacity of our blood, which we already talked about. You can go to altitude. More evidence is coming out that we can use heat training to also increase our hemoglobin content and have more blood and have more hemoglobin. And we can affect the AVO2 difference, so the oxygen extraction, the extraction abilities of oxygen at the periphery, so in the muscles. But it's already really high in someone who's not that trained, so it can't actually improve that much. So I can't find the paper now, but I've seen research that has suggested about 70% of the improvements in VO2 max can be explained by changes in cardiac output. So most of the research then is focused on how can you how can you improve that cardiac output? How can to improve your VO2 max? Two things. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of determinants of VO2 max. I think there's also some confusion around VO2 max. I think one of them is people don't think it's actually that trainable, and it's not as trainable as other things such as our thresholds and our economy, which are the other two primary determinants of endurance performance. But that doesn't mean it's not trainable. I think we see that if someone starts a training program, the first thing that's probably going to plateau is their VO2 max. If someone takes up long-term endurance training, but I would say that anecdotally 95% of people could still improve their VO2 max with more training, better training, different training. So it is worth paying attention to. It's not like there is a genetic component to it. There is only so much you can increase the size of your left ventricle. Obviously you can't just have it pounding out of your chest. But actually, most people haven't got to the point where it's completely plateaued. And your example with you is actually you've been training a long time. You've had your VO2 max measured a long time, and you've seen the highest it's ever been recorded in December 2024.
Yeah, and I'd say as well, I think when we're referring to people there thinking you can't really train it, that's probably more in the science evidence-based community. Because of popular and I guess like seminal sort of bits of work. One that we've mentioned before is like it probably comes up in most of the podcasts we do is the work by Andy Jones, like following Paula Radcliffe, and like it's one of the main takeaways, and that paper gets cited as like VO2 max levels off first, doesn't improve very much, and then the other sort of determinants of math and performance that we talked about increase over time. But then at the other end, you have, again, we're referring to club runners, UK especially based club runners who either jog. Some of them don't do that. Some of them run way too hard, but jog or do really, really high intensity sessions, VO2 max sessions like year round. And I guess maybe to them VO2 max is constantly trainable in their sort of mind. Or it's probably also a case of it's the only training variable they probably know really much about. So to them, it's really trainable, and it's probably actually somewhere in the middle, right? Like it is a bit trainable through some specific methods, but it's not constantly trainable, and it's not something where like faster is better in terms of the intervals, which we'll get onto.
We'll get onto that. I guess with that Paula Radcliffe paper, which is we can link it in the show notes, but it just tracks her physiology pretty much over the course of her career. And her VO2 max is, I think the first test is when she's 18, and her VO2 max is 70, so it's already really high. So that's one thing, that she's already got a massive VO2 max. So how much more can it improve? And the other thing is actually the training Paula Radcliffe was doing when she was 18 would be way higher than what most people are doing now. I haven't got the numbers, but I can tell you that I think a typical model was 3 hard sessions a week, and she'd have been doing that. She was a prolific junior. She won World Junior Cross. So this is before she's 8. This is under 20. And she was winning English schools and all that as a 14, 15-year-old. So she had been training more than most of the population for quite a few years by the time she got to 18 at that first test. So maybe by then, she has maxed out what she's going to get in a VO2 max. But most people aren't training at the level of Paula Radcliffe when she was 18. It's basically the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, and I'd say as well, like, that part of the reason that specific paper comes up, apart from the fact it's like a good, interesting bit of work, is there's not really much longitudinal work on, especially like running physiology and determinants of running performance. Like at best, they're 12 weeks long, because that's the length of a uni term. The reason that paper comes up is because it is longitudinal, and we roughly know what she was doing, but there's also not much else. That's why we're talking about a paper from, like, when was that paper put out? Like 2005 maybe, or was it a bit later? Yeah, whereas, there's lots of papers like where we've been looking at this where it's like 2 weeks of sprint training.
Yeah.
And then that gets reported in the mainstream as sprint training is better for your VO2 max, but only across 2 weeks, like not across 6 months, not across 12 weeks that you're training for a marathon. So we are having to do what sports scientists especially have to do, and take some knowledge and then fill in the gap to a degree, which we can sort of do. Like, there is good evidence, but that's part of why we bring up that Paula Radcliffe paper a lot, because there's not much else like it.
And I think there probably is a lot of case study data, but it's all locked up in professional sport teams.
I
guess. I mean, for me, for example, like my first time I had my VO2 max done, I think I must have been about 20. I reckon I was 22, 23. I was early 20s before I was it was definitely, it was about 75, 76. Pretty sure it's 75 from memory. And I've had it a few times since, and I've hit like 80 3 times. So I'm pretty confident it did improve, but now has plateaued. So, and again, like 80 is pretty big, and I don't necessarily need that to be any higher. And so I imagine, maybe if I really focused on improving, it would go up slightly more. But actually, I do think it has changed over the course of 3, 4, 5 more years of training. It's a shame I haven't got one from 18 as well, but I would bet that it has gone up with more training. I think that's the first myth, isn't it? Like, but it's not trainable. I think so a lot of people, maybe you're right, maybe that's more of a scientific consensus, but it's not that trainable. But I think there's definitely people who believe out there that it's a bit fixed, and it is not as trainable as other variables, but it can improve still. So that's one thing I wanted to get out of the way. And I think another misnomer is irrelevance to performance. And again, this might be coming more from the scientific community, but I've definitely seen people out there saying actually VO2 max isn't that important. Like, there's world-class endurance athletes who haven't got a massive VO2 max, and that is true. There are world-class runners who have got a VO2 max of in the high 60s, early 70s, whereas, like I said, I'm a not quite world-class runner with VO2 max of 80. So there's definitely not a completely linear relationship between VO2 max and performance. However, you also need a high enough VO2 max to be in the game. You're not going to find a world-class endurance runner with VO2 max of 50. It's just not going to happen. And the reason why is because you can compensate to a certain extent from having a low VO2 max by being really economical, so be really good at converting that oxygen into speed, or by having really good thresholds, so you can sustain a really high percentage of your VO2 max for a given period of time. If you've got your threshold at 90% of your VO2 max, then actually you're going to be able to hold that for an hour plus. And if you're really good at converting that oxygen to speed, that's going to allow you to run at a pretty good speed. But a VO2 max of 50 isn't going to cut that, because it's only so economical you can get, and there's only so close you can get your thresholds to VO2 max. So it does need to be high enough. And I think 70 is probably where you would see that limit in men, like maybe a bit lower in women, like 65 maybe as a ballpark. That
sort of gives you the right to be like competing at an elite level, but then it's within a big range, isn't it? And you say like relevance to performance, and like you mentioned that like your VO2 max 6-7 years ago was 75, and I'm pretty certain it was 75 before Valencia as well, wasn't it?
We predicted it about that, so do a VO2 max test, but
how fast do you think you would have run a marathon 7-8 years ago? Like,
oh yeah, exactly.
I think it would be a lot slower, right?
As a direct marker of performance, the thresholds are the ones that are going to most correlate with performance in anything from 5k upwards, I would say. But like I said, you do need a high enough VO2 max. It's not that it's not important. It's just that endurance is more complicated than just having a good VO2 max. It's a combination of the VO2 max, the thresholds, and the economy. And that was like one of the very first episodes I put out was physiological model of endurance performance and talking about the interaction between those three variables. That's how you're going to determine how fast you can run over a given event, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, VO2 max is really important. Probably more important for the shorter duration events, so like the 15, the 3K, the 5K, the 10K, because you in a marathon, for example, you can compensate by having if you've got a slightly lower VO2 max, and you can compensate by having really, really good threshold. So you can sit really close to that VO2 max for a long time. And the threshold is still important in the shorter events, because you're going to go into, you're not going to generate as much lactate or produce as much acidity and other waste products as quickly into the event, but you're going to be operating at VO2 max intensity during the race. Sure. So that's what I would say that you need. Well, if you're world class at 5K or 15 or half marathon or marathon, you're going to be fantastic at all three of those components. But in the middle distances, you need VO2 max is really important, as well as good thresholds and economy and speed and anaerobic capacity. You just got to be good at everything, basically. But yeah, I think key takeaways I was trying to get were actually it is trainable, but not super trainable, and also it is relevant to performance, even though it doesn't directly correlate with performance. That doesn't mean it's not important. It is still really important. It needs to be high enough. It doesn't need to be world class, but it needs to be high enough to give you the ability to improve your thresholds and be really economical.
Yeah. Should we get into how to train it and what some of the research says?
Yeah, if you do that. So I was going to start with a really classic paper by Stephen Seiler, which, let me find the title for you here.
I've got it if you want.
You got it? You want to start us off?
Yeah, hold on.
I got it now.
Click into that tab.
Adaptations to aerobic interval training, interactive effects of exercise intensity and total work duration. Published in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science and Sport, which is a great journal because that's where I've got my work published too. So it must be a good journal. 2013, and yeah, it's a bit of a classic. It's basically what they did is they had a group of, this is cyclists, so that's the caveat, this is cyclists, but it's pretty.
A lot of this is cyclists though, like doing sprint sessions is easier on a bike than.
It's just easier to control intensity cycling versus running. So a lot of the stuff is in cyclists, but I don't think that means it's not transferable. I'd say that in terms of VO2 max, your heart doesn't know. We've said with the heart, the cardiac adaptations are most important. Your heart doesn't know if you're cycling, swimming, or running. So I think the VO2 max in particular, the training, these sort of studies are pretty comparable, and more work has been done replicating this sort of stuff in runners. So I'm pretty confident in sharing this study as hanging my hat, and it's pretty important and pretty indicative of what would happen in runners. But basically what they did is they got 3 or 4 groups actually of cyclists. One group just did low intensity training for 7 weeks. One group did 4 by 4 minute intervals twice a week with 2 minutes recovery. One group did 4 by 8 minutes with 2 minutes recovery twice a week, and one group did 4 by 16 minutes with 3 minutes recovery twice a week. I mean, just pretty boring. They did the same session twice a week for 7 weeks. Importantly, though, the intensity was set by the athlete. So they're basically told, forgive me if I'm wrong, is just to go maximize the power output you could hold for each session. Yep. So try and by the end of each rep, at the end of the final rep of each session, you should be at a 19 out of 20 on the Borg scale, or 9 out of 10 effort. And you should try and match the intensity across the work bout. So it was self-paced basically, which is nice because it's real world. It's not hold this percentage of VO2 max for this duration. It's pretty similar to a club night. Go and do 4 by 4 minutes and run it nearly as hard as you can.
Yeah, although if you did that at club night, I think rep 1 would be way faster than rep 4, but depends on the club. I think that's a really important point to mention about the intensity of the efforts, because that's what sets this paper, I think, apart, at least at the time. Like they refer to it as ISO effort. Where it was self-paced, and it was complete the intervals and like nothing else. Like that's your aim, and pace it appropriately. They also had pretty good, like over 90% of the sessions were completed, which is like pretty good. Like if I didn't know the outcome, I'd be like, oh, they must have had loads of people blowing up in this. Like at least the first week or two. Like no, that's an important part of this, and it sort of comes out in the results as well. How this sort of ISO effort it matters.
Yeah, 100%. I guess other things to mention, these are trained but recreational cyclists. So we got a VO2 max, mean VO2 max was 52 plus or minus 6 mil per kilogram per minute. So they're good cyclists, but they're not world class, they're not national class, but they're good cyclists. And again, that's probably allowing you to make sure that you are going to see some changes in VO2 max, because if they came in and had a VO2 max of 70 to start with, then you're probably not going to see massive changes. I'm not saying that you're not going to see changes, but it's going to be harder statistically to be able to see those changes, because the magnitude of the changes is going to be smaller. They had them, like, the participants were doing 4 to 10 hours a week of training, which I think if you convert that to running, that's probably, I don't know. You say like 1 to 6 hours. Like you could do that 4 hours a week in one ride as a cyclist, couldn't you? So that's sort of I guess equivalent running wise. So they're not Dan doing like 10 plus hours a week or more. And during this study they also did low intensity riding, so they did about 6 hours a week of low intensity work, and then the interval sessions added up to about an hour and a half of each as well, and they maintained that during the block. So the easy ones just did a bit more easy riding, and then the other ones, the 3 groups doing the interval training, did some easy riding around their hard sessions. So did about 7 weeks. I guess the first thing to note is actually what was the physiological response acutely during one of those sessions, which was quite interesting. RP of the last bout was pretty similar across all of the interval groups, which is great. RP across all bouts was pretty similar, so they did a good job of matching the load in terms of the effort, ISO load as you called it. Heart rate, peak heart rate was 88% in the 4x16, 90% in the 4x8, 94% in the 4x4. And then the lactate response, let's have a look at that as well. So 4.9 millimole after the 4x16, 9.6 after the 4x8, and 13.2 after the 4x4. So that's what the physiological response to those sessions were. Let's talk about the outcomes. They obviously measured their VO2 max pre and post, which is the key output we're talking about today, but actually they measured lots of other things as well. They looked at VO2 peak, they call it. We won't get into the difference between VO2 max and VO2 peak, but you can for the purpose of today, you can think of them as interchangeable. They also looked at the power at VO2 peak, the power at 4 millimole of lactate, which is like a proxy for looking at what their threshold is, and their time to exhaustion of 80% of their VO2 peak as well. And out of all the groups, consistently, the one that improved the most was the 4x8 minutes. And in terms of their VO2 peak, that improved by about 7% on average in that 4x8 group versus, I'm reading this with a graph, so it's a loose here, 3% with a 4x4 and about 3% with a 4x16, and about 3% with just doing low intensity training. So there was if we can share put this a link to this paper in the show notes, so you can have a proper look at it. But takeaway is that VO2 peak was only different to the baseline to just doing low intensity group. They did that statistical comparison, so the intervals versus the low intensity. The 4x8 was the only one that was statistically better. And if you look at power at VO2 peak, time to exhaustion at 8% of their VO2 max, power at 4 millimole, same story comes out. 4x8, much better than 4x4 or 4x16. Does that make sense as an output? An output? Do you think I've summarised that fairly?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you just went and said to someone, actually, like 4x8 minutes is the best way of improving your VO2 max, I don't think you'd get many club runners like believe in you.
Well, that's the thing. Like, if we look at where the heart rate got up to, go back to that initial description I gave of physiological responses. What the authors say is that actually, your heart rate gets higher in the 4x4. So, they were getting up to 94% of their heart rate peak during the 4x4 bout. And you've got to think this is an average across like many sessions. Then, we're going to be, some people are getting pretty close to 100% of their heart rate max. They're having really big lactate responses. They're going hard here. But actually, if we go 4x8 minutes, well, they're doing twice as much cycling, but the peak heart rate only drops from 94% to 90% of heart rate max, which is not that big a deal. Would you notice dropping by 4%? Not that your heart isn't going to notice very much, if at all. Now, if you drop down to 4x16, you get to 88%, and basically the consensus seems to be that it's more effective to not do work at 100% of your VO2 max, but actually to work just slightly below, because you can just achieve so much more work. The intensity of the difference between doing 4x8 here in this session and 4x4 wasn't that much, but they did twice as much cycling. But going out to 4x16, the intensity probably isn't quite high enough to get those adaptations. And so this consensus seems to be that the most important thing is accumulating minutes where you're above 90% of your VO2 max. That's going to be roughly 90% of your heart rate max. It's not quite as clear cut as that, because it's a pretty linear relationship between heart rate and VO2, but it's not like a 1-to-1. You can use it as a proxy for 90% of heart rate max. So and the reason why getting above 90% is important is because it's a cardiac adaptation we want. So we want to be pretty close to our VO2 max, because what's going to happen is when our heart rate's pumping loads, we're going to get a load of preload. So we're going to our left ventricle is going to have loads of blood forced into it. That's going to cause it to have eccentric hypertrophy. So the ventricle is going to get stretched, it's going to get larger, and then we're going to pump against that blood in the heart, that pressure, which is going to cause the hypertrophy of the walls. So it needs to be a certain intensity, but actually the difference between 90 and 100% of VO2 max isn't that much. And so just getting that seems to be the minimum, but once we're above there, actually doesn't matter that much. And so it's better to be just a little bit lower and then do more work than being right at VO2 max.
And I think I don't remember exactly if they specifically asked this question of all the participants, or it just sort of came out, but they mentioned that the 4x8 minutes was sort of less like stressful as well. Maybe a more enjoyable training session doing, or I don't know, they're all going to be hard, aren't they? They're doing them to essentially failure.
Yeah.
But yeah, 4x8 minutes was a bit more manageable, and you had better physiological response, which is sort of a nice balance. So you don't have to absolutely like obliterate yourself doing short intervals. This longer interval, and if you have these two, like we've sort of said it, you have these two variables at play of intensity and duration, and you have to find the sort of like nice middle ground between them. You can go run for 3 hours, but the intensity is going to be incredibly low. Or you can go run for 15 seconds and the intensity is going to be really high, but the duration is going to be really low. There's a middle ground, and I think it's a lot further towards the duration side than a lot of people maybe think.
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's one of the big take homes of this. I would say as well, for like maybe something to think about as well for runners especially, is like we said, these were self-paced, this sort of ISO effort. Complete this as best you can, essentially to failure at the end of the last rep. And because they're cycling, it's going to be a bit more like self-paced. Like, you're not thinking about a minute per kilometer or minute per mile pace. I don't know if they had their power outputs hidden. I can't remember if they did.
They probably did.
I think if I was designing a study, I would have hidden the power outputs.
Yeah.
So you're completely self-pacing these reps, and that's maybe also something else to think about, is when you're self-pacing, that might actually be a better guide of getting to this 90% intensity. Obviously, you could also go by heart rate. That's another option as well. But yeah, rather than being, oh, this is my VO2 max pace, or this is the pace for this session, because there's going to be reasons why that isn't the case. Not just like measurement issues with your watch, but how you are actually feeling, how your body is doing that day will affect the session. Whereas if you just self-pace, you're probably going to have as good an outcome, especially when you start doing it by time rather than distance. But no, I think it's a really good paper, isn't it? Like,
yeah. And I started about one because I think it's a really nice, it's pretty clear cut, and it's nice of it. It's just off of effort and minutes, and you go, okay, what's the response to doing this training session for 7 weeks in this case? So just it's pretty nice and easy to understand. But while I'm just getting up a paper here, but actually a higher level of confidence in the scientific process is to look at a meta-analysis, which basically summates a load of trainings. A one-off training study is nice, but I don't want to hang my hat on just a one-off training study. I think how much confidence can you have? It was only 35 people. It was cyclists versus runners. What we don't know all the details of what went on. Maybe it was just chance, but on that one paper, that was a finding they had. So what a better thing to do is to look at a meta-analysis, and that's sort of seen as the highest level of evidence when making decisions about anything, whether it's exercise or whatever. So went through that paper first because it's a really nice clear-cut example, but I've got this meta-analysis here, which was effects of different protocols of high-intensity interval training for VO2 max improvements in adults, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And this was a pretty thorough job. Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport, so not a bad journal, published in 2019. And what is nice is that it sort of echoes the same findings that was found in that Seiler paper. So it reinforces that, in that they looked at, it was how many papers was it? 53 studies met the eligibility criteria. So they got not just looked at one study, they've looked at 53 studies. Which I can't find the total number of participants, but I've got a feeling it was in the 300s, so much better than 35 from just that single study. And the main findings were, actually, even short intervals, like under 30 seconds, and a low volume, like 5 minutes of total work, can improve VO2 max. So that's more like doing sprint interval training, like more what you'd associate with doing 800 meter pace stuff. So that sort of training did improve VO2 max in the short term, but there was a clear increase or better effects of intervals that were longer, so intervals that were over 2 minutes in length, and where the total volume of the session was over 15 minutes of work. So they did over 15 minutes of intervals in the session. And also an effect of how long they did it for. So doing it for 4 weeks was more effective than doing it for 2 weeks, which is, you'd hope, pretty self-explanatory. But it goes to show that actually you don't just get all of these adaptations from the longer intervals in just a week or two. It's more, actually, in this case, they said 4 to 12 weeks continue to show improvement effects. And again, that echoes the work of Seiler there, but actually doing more longer intervals seems to be better than doing short sprint interval stuff. And the reason seems to be that you actually, if you think about doing short intervals, well, you're actually not going to get your heart rate and your VO2 up very high for that long. I think I always think of a classic club session is 10 400s off a minute or off 90 seconds at about 1500 meters to 3k race pace, and people go, oh yeah, that's a VO2 max session. But actually, that's probably, based on this literature, probably not that effective a session, because if you looked at someone's heart rate response to that, yeah, it's gonna peak at the end of each 400 meter interval, but as soon as you stop running, it's going to drop down again, and it's going to be below 90% of. To be honest, in that sort of session, you're going to be lucky if it gets above 90% of your VO2 max, just because the interval duration isn't that long. And so if you looked at the minutes that you accumulated above 90% compared to doing something like 5 by 5 minutes or 4 by 8 minutes, you're going to have so much more time in 4 by 8 minutes above 90% of your heart rate max, or if you were measuring VO2, above 90% of your VO2 max in that session versus doing 10 by 400 of a minute recovery.
Yeah. One of the other things this meta-analysis sort of mentions is that they actually talk about the differences in these papers where they're using can't remember how they define it exactly. Is it like healthy participants, and then the version I have doesn't have the graphs, but they specifically mention that they're some of the studies included are looking at obese or unhealthy populations, and the way that VO2 max is measured doesn't take into account any weight loss. So the way that VO2 max is presented, in terms of the number that everyone compares as the sort of the sort of like Pokemon card, this is what my VO2 max is, or my top trump, this is what my VO2 max is. Yeah. It's scaled for body weight. So if you put a bunch of people through an exercise trial that are obese and then they lose weight, but their VO2 in terms of the liters a minute doesn't change, their VO2 max in terms of the scale to body weight would go up because they've lost weight. Yeah. Which is going to impact the results when you're including those studies of people that are completely sedentary and obese and then go to exercising. There's probably more likely than not they're going to lose some weight. So that's going to impact the results as well. And the other thing they mention, which I think it's probably a whole other podcast about it, is things like publication bias. So you're not going to publish a study if you do sprint training and there's no impact, or if you do long reps and there's no impact.
Yeah.
So
it's hard. It's wrong, but it's harder to publish a study where they didn't find anything. But they did find they found that they did find having no effect of an intervention isn't not finding something. It's showing that intervention has no effect. That is a finding. But unfortunately, because of this, you're much more likely to get a study published if there is your intervention does this, your intervention does that, rather than my intervention doesn't do anything. People aren't as excited about that, which means it doesn't get published, and then you do a meta-analysis and all these non-findings but didn't get published are not part of that meta-analysis, and so you get this publication bias, and this meta-analysis can even, although it's good in that you're collecting a load of studies, all of these studies are you're only getting half of the picture.
I think it's worth mentioning as well, isn't it? Like, again, the way that this then makes it to mainstream is like we said, sprint interval training improves VO2 max, but that's only over 2 weeks, and that's the one study that gets published, not the 9 that didn't have any impact and don't get published.
I've just scrolled down to that paper. There's actually a really nice graph right at the bottom. I think if you've got the same one as me, it's they've all their graphs at the bottom of the paper, but it's magnitudes of effect of different protocols of HIIT in different populations, and it gives breaks down, and those people who aren't as well trained, they're going to have bigger improvements in VO2 max than those who are in an athletic population, but actually quite consistently across the groups, the ones that do the high intensity training and not the sprint interval training are the ones that have the bigger increases in their VO2 max. which is nice. Matt echoes again what the literature says, what Seiler found in his paper there, that actually spending time at a high percentage of your VO2 max, not necessarily at VO2 max, is probably the most important factor when designing your sessions. And what is nice is that we can use heart rate as a pretty good proxy there, and you can assess how good your training sessions are. You can put a heart rate, you can get a pretty good idea of your heart rate max by wearing your heart rate monitor during a 5k or a 3k or a 1500 meters. Your heart rate is going to be at max at the end, and your criteria should be, right, in my session, how many minutes do I accumulate above 90% of my heart rate max?
The important part of what you've just said there is put on a heart rate monitor. Don't use your watch.
Have a chest strap, have one of the arm bands on. Don't just go off your wrist heart rate as a general rule of thumb, because the data is pretty rubbish most of the time. And you can then go and look at your own data, go look at your own training sessions, go, actually, where did I get the most amount of time at a high percentage of my VO2 max? And I can guarantee you it won't be doing 10 400s off a minute. It would be doing something like 5 or 6 times a mile off of 2 to 3 minutes rest. You'll have a much higher time for the same effort. If you go, right, I'm going out 9 out of 10 in both sessions, you're going to see higher heart rates. But I do think if you went into your and did 4 by 16 minutes or 4 by 5k, you're just not going to be able to hit a high enough intensity to actually spend maybe any minutes above 90% of your heart rate max. I would find that quite hard. I could probably, if I really pushed it, the last one maybe I could get it a bit over, but that's going to be pretty hard. Whereas actually, if you're doing 5 or 6 times 5 minutes or a mile or whatever, that would be hard but tolerable.
Yeah. Should we I think now, after saying longer reps are better, should we chuck in the curveball of 30-30s and 30-15s? Yeah. Do
you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I'm just getting to the state now. I guess more talk about it wider. Especially if you listen to any sort of discussion about cycling and cycling training, especially 30-30s and 30-15s are a really popular training session. So that's essentially 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, or 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. And this comes from someone that we've mentioned a bunch. I think we said we'd like to interview from Ben Ronstad. Well, I never know if I'm pronouncing that O correct, but he's from I guess Norway, I think.
Norway,
Yeah, and this is again, work on what intervals improve VO2 max the most. I think the paper I've got here, at least one of the papers I've got, it's more looking at elite cyclists, but still useful work. And at least the paper I've got is 30-15s, they compared those really short intervals, but then probably more importantly, short recoveries against longer intervals. So they compared it to 4 by 5 minutes, and basically found there was a slightly better improvement in VO2 max. They also looked at VO2. They look at VO2 at 4 millimoles of blood lactate,
something like that.
Which is I don't know, it's an odd measurement to me, but essentially they found the shorter intervals were slightly better than the longer intervals, and this is in very, very good cyclists. So their average VO2 max like 73.
And Ronstad's done quite a lot of stuff on optimizing interval trainings to improve VO2 max. He's done things like, instead of doing 5 by 5 minutes, they've gone, right, we're going to do the first minute about 5 minutes as hard as we can, and then drop intensity down a little bit so that they can actually get to 5 minutes. And that showed to get your heart rate a bit higher and your VO2 a bit higher for the on average for the 5 minute blocks, and hopefully that would translate into a better response. And one thing that he has done quite a lot of work of is 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, and normally they do, I think it's 3 sets of 13 seconds on, 15 seconds off. Don't ask me why it's 13, but that's just what they probably probably to match the load between a different training session they were doing. But anyway, without getting into details, the idea is that if you do 10 by 400 of a minute recovery, then your heart rate is going to drop as soon as you've finished at that 400, and by the time you start your next one, it could be down to 100 beats per minute. Maybe not quite that low, but it's definitely nowhere near 90% of your heart rate max. Whereas if you keep recoveries really short, then the heart rate doesn't have time, and VO2 doesn't have time to drop very much. And so you can, if you looked at the heart rate and VO2 response, it wouldn't look like doing multiple intervals, like 13 times 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. It would look like the heart rate just goes up and stays really high for, what's that add up to? 45 seconds times 13. It's about 10 minutes, isn't it? 9 minutes of 9 minutes, and then we'll drop back down again. So you can put out some really high speeds. If you're thinking about running, doing 200 meters at about 3k race pace, so you can accumulate quite a lot of work at fast speeds whilst maintaining a high cardiovascular stress or cardiovascular response. So that's the caveat. I think in general, longer intervals are better, but there's some work, mostly in cycling, I would say, but you can get a very similar response, maybe a better response, but I think that's still to be decided, of doing short intervals, but you've got to keep recoveries really short. And I would say for me, it would be like 200 on, like max of 20 seconds off. If you take 30 seconds, your heart rate is going to drop a lot in 30 seconds. And it depends how long you do the 200s in as well. But, if you do 30 seconds on, take 15 seconds off. If you're doing the 200s in 40 seconds, maybe you can afford to take 20 seconds off. But actually, even if you're going to do 400s, you can probably only take 20, 25, maybe 30 seconds off. You can't have any longer than that, because even then the heart rate is going to drop a lot. With the longer intervals, the recovery doesn't actually matter that much, because you don't need to keep your heart rate up during recovery, because you're doing the long intervals, you're going to accumulate minutes, because regardless if you might actually want to be better taking 2 or 3 minutes of rest, because that's going to allow you to keep putting out high speeds, but going to get your heart rate up and to keep it nice and high. So then I would go, you don't want a minute, you probably want 2 minutes minimum. But if you're doing the short intervals, so by that I think I'd say anything under a minute, really, you need to keep recovery really, really short.
Yeah, maybe even a minute and a half. If
I sort of think
this, yeah,
because that meta-analysis said long intervals 2 minutes and longer.
Yeah, true.
And then you go, but most of this short interval stuff is being a minute and shorter. So I sort of feel that 90 seconds to 2 minutes is a bit of a grey area, and that they're long enough to hurt, but not long enough to get your heart rate up very high, because it takes about 2 minutes minimum to get any sort of steady state. And then actually, if you have recoveries really short, then it's hard to keep the intensity up. So I don't know. I think there's a balance there. I would either go 3 minutes or longer personally, or a minute or shorter. 400's a push. 75 seconds if you're fit. But maybe 200s or 300s give you a better response. That's one of those ones where you can now go and play around with it, do some different sessions, try some different sessions, and see which one gets your heart rate as highest for longest, which one gets you 90% of your heart rate max the most.
Yeah, I mean, having anecdotally again, 30-15s or doing something like that is really hard to get right. The first few times, because it's very easy to go very hard.
Yeah.
Those first few reps.
Yeah.
And also 15 seconds, you by the time you've stopped, that's by the time your watch has beeped and then you've stopped, that's 5 seconds.
And I do think that's one of the advantages of the cycling versus the running, is that you don't have to get yourself back to a start line or whatever. You can just go again straight away. So it does actually feel like a break, but like you said, by the time you beep your watch, you stop, slow down, you've got 10 seconds left to get back on the start line. Feels quite hard. And I have played around a little bit with the 200s off 15-20 seconds recovery, and that's what I found actually I prefer to go and do 5 times 5 minutes, 5 times 6 minutes,
Yeah.
Than doing the 200s. But maybe that's just me as a person. I am such a slow switcher that I find anything fast hard anyway.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing. Yeah, people go too hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, if we're equating this to 200 as well, like, again, to emphasize the point, like, it's for research purposes, but they do like 13 of these reps off 15 seconds. Like, I don't know of any runners that are doing like I saw like 10 by 200, but that's off a long rest, or like 200 meters jog, which is way too long a recovery. I guess you could start,
a lot of intervals, like, if the example be doing like 3 sets of 10 times 200, which psychologically that's quite hard, isn't it? I think I would, again, I prefer to go and do 6-minute reps personally, but maybe someone who's more of a middle distance athlete would prefer breaking it up, especially when you are not actually running them. You're running them hard, but not that hard. 3K pace, I think, is a good ballpark starting point to get a cardiovascular response.
Yeah, that's maybe a good if we're starting to think about like some takeaways to finish off, like, try these, but like really maybe be cautious about the pace you start at, because it's very easy to go too hard in either of these sort of types of sessions, either 4 by 5 to 8 minutes, or the 200s. Like, there's going to be there's not going to be any difference to your race performance in 2 months time if you go slightly too slow the first few times you try these. So try them out, start off slow, and I think also like we've presented two bits of research that show quite different approaches to training to what, again, club runners would do. Like, I'm trying to think of some club session, like 10. I mean, I've got 10 by 400 here. Both of these are quite different to that.
And even like another one that people do is like 5 by a K. And that's that's not a bad session. But if you think about what that is most similar to, that's most similar to doing 4 by 4 minutes in that silo paper. You'd actually get more benefit by dropping it back from 5K pace to 10K pace and doing twice as much running. That's basically what the literature seems to suggest, and that's what I see as well. In the people who keep hammering out short intervals, they get a bit better, and then they plateau, and they don't get any better.
And I think that's like you just said, that's what the literature sort of shows as well. Like the sprint intervals and really short intervals, the really high intensity work for a couple of weeks, but then, I mean, part of it is there's not the biggest evidence base, but I think part of the not big evidence base is because it doesn't work. Whereas reducing the intensity seems to work for longer and provide a bigger improvement. And then I had another thought there, but it's completely gone from my mind.
I think one thing that should be clear to say before we wrap things up is, but actually, we're talking about improvements in VO2max here. I'm not saying that 10 by 400 is the worst session ever, because if you want to get ready for a 1500 meter race, you need to have some sort of stimulus there. Actually, those high intensity bouts with longer recoveries are good for things like your anaerobic capacity, for improving your pH buffering. So we can increase the bicarbonate buffer, which naturally occurs in our blood by doing sprint interval training. To be able to sprint fast, you need to be able to practice sprinting in training. And there are definitely benefits of doing that stuff. But if you're after aerobic adaptations or improving your VO2max, doing 10 by 400 is not the best way of doing it. The other thing to say is that if you are not that well trained, doing any running is going to improve your VO2max. And there's a clear literature to show that. If you're a couch to 5K, if you've only been running for a year, if you're only running 2 or 3 days a week, running 3 or 4 days a week, or 4 or 5 days, up to increasing that to 4 or 5 or 5 or 6 days a week is probably going to increase your VO2max. But when you're getting to the point where you've done a fair bit of training, then yeah, that's when you need to sort of be a bit more specific with the stimulus you give your body.
Yeah, I think the other point I was going to make has come back into my mind. Like if you're looking at your sessions and like take the amount of actual work that you're doing, if it's below 15 minutes, then maybe start to think about, okay, what change could I make to the session to make it at least 20, if not 25 minutes long. And that's probably going to be the easiest way is to reduce the intensity and increase the length of the interval. I would say, I don't know, if you want to try making them 30-second reps, then that wouldn't be the way I'd go.
Let us know how you get on.
Yeah. But yeah, no, start to just think about the amount of time spent doing work in a session, and then the amount of recovery time. And it's still going to be fairly high if you're doing like the 4x8 minutes, but it's not going to be the recovery time isn't going to be greater than the amount of like work done in that session. Whereas if you go and do 10x400 off a 200 jog, I reckon, like, being honest, most people, the recovery is going to be equal. That jog is going to be like really stretching the definition of jog. Yeah, so just think about increasing the amount of like work done. I think it's like a nice, easy way to put it.
The key message to come away from this is there's a trade-off between intensity and duration, and actually on balance, most people, not everybody, but most people, some people could be the other way, but most people are doing, the intensity is a bit too high and the duration isn't quite enough. You don't want to go the extreme of doing 60 minutes of intervals, because you're just not going to be able to do, the intensity is not going to be high enough for VO2max adaptations. But doing just 10 minutes or 15 minutes of work is probably not optimal either. So somewhere in there is a sweet spot, probably around 30 minutes of work where you can put out a high enough intensity, so above, where you're getting a good amount of minutes above 9% of your VO2 max, but you're also doing a good duration of work, so 30 minutes. And that's what that side of paper pretty much comes down to, that there's a sweet spot between intensity and duration. Probably sits at about 30 minutes of work where you're working pretty hard but not quite flat out.
Yeah,
that's a good key takeaway.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Hopefully it's given some people some food for thought. I think it's always worth considering, isn't it? Is this the optimal? Could I be doing something different? Yeah. Hopefully might spark a few ideas. Yeah,
nice. And I guess, just to highlight this, we're talking about VO2 max here. We're not talking about thresholds, although some of those those ideas are the same. Like, reduce the intensity a bit, you can do quite a lot more work. There are definitely times where you need to do really high intensity stuff, where you are just doing 10x400 meters at 1500 meter race pace or whatever. But in general, for aerobic adaptations, there's going to be a sweet spot between intensity and duration, and I think most people are sitting at too high up on the intensity and not long enough on the duration. But it's, we're all individuals, it's case by case basis. But yeah, that's what I see, that's what the literature suggests. But anyway, should we wrap that up there?
Let's leave it there.
Yeah, thanks for listening. I hope you've all enjoyed. If there's any questions, then go post on our Instagram page we've got now. So if you haven't already, go check us out on Instagram. Physiology.endurance.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that.
Physiology.of.endurance.
That's it, yeah. Physiology.
Rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, really, really, really smooth. But if you got our own Instagram profiles, you'll find us. But yeah, I hope everyone's had a good Christmas, and we'll catch you again soon.